Dad, you don't belong here anymore. The words came out of my son's mouth as if he had rehearsed them in front of a mirror. Michael stood in the middle of my living room, with his arms crossed, his polished shoes planted firm on the hardwood floor that I had refinished with my own hands 20 years earlier. His tone was clipped and cold, the way he might dismiss a witness in court. Except this time it was me, his father, being dismissed. Karen stood just behind him, her arms folded tight across her chest. She did not bother to soften the blow. Richard, you need to think about selling this house and moving out. It is too big for you. You cannot take care of it anymore. Her words stung, not because I had not heard them before, but because of the casual certainty with which she spoke, as though my life, my home, and my worth could be reduced to a burden on her weekend schedule. The old clock above the mantel ticked loudly in the silence that followed. I sat in the recliner that had molded to my body over the years, my fingers gripping the worn arms until I felt the fabric bite into my palms. My heart pounded hard against my chest, but I said nothing. I simply stared at them, at the son I had raised, and the woman he had chosen standing together in judgment of me. Michael let out a breath, as if I was already exasperating him. Dad, it is not logical for you to stay here. The property taxes alone are eating into your retirement. The roof needs fixing. The furnace is on its last legs. You could move into a condo on the east side of Springfield. I have a friend in real estate who can handle the listing quickly. You would be better off, better off. The phrase rolled around in my head. Better off without the oak tree I planted the year Michael was born. Better off without the porch Laura and I had painted together on a July afternoon, laughing as we dripped paint on each other. Better off without the memories that seeped into every wall and floorboard. Karen added quickly, as if to drive the nail in deeper. And you would be closer to us. We could keep an eye on you. I raised my eyes to meet hers. There was no warmth in her expression, only calculation. Her voice carried no concern for me, only the efficiency of a plan she and Michael had already discussed. This is my home, I said finally, my voice quieter than I expected. Michael shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing with the same look he used in courtrooms to corner an opponent. It was Dad. But things change. You cannot hold on forever. The photographs on the wall behind him blurred. Laura smiling in her Sunday dress, Emily and Michael as children on the porch steps, our old retriever bounding through the yard. Years of sacrifice, years of building a life reduced to an inconvenient obstacle in my son's future plans. I pushed myself up from the recliner, my knees stiff but steady beneath me. You think I am a burden. Karen shifted her stance, her lips pursed. We just want what is best for you. For me or for you, I wanted to ask. The words stayed locked in my throat. Michael pressed a hand to his forehead, sighing as though I was being unreasonable. Dad, you have to face reality. The house is too much. You are too old to keep up with it. Too old. I had worked these hands to the bone for decades. They still carried the calluses of a life spent in sawdust and sweat. Every nail and board in this place bore my mark. Too old, he said, as though years of sacrifice had left me useless. I turned to the window, looking out at the yard. The oak tree stood tall against the fading light, its branches reaching wide. Laura had loved that tree. Emily had swung from its lowest branch when she was small. I had built that swing myself. The memories flooded back, not as comfort, but as fuel, reminding me of what I had given to keep this place alive. When I faced them again, something inside me had settled. I no longer felt the sting of their words. Instead, I felt a weight lift, replaced by something sharper. a resolve I had not felt in years. "You will regret this," I said, my voice steady now. "Both of you." Michael frowned, confused by the certainty in my tone. Karen crossed her arms tighter, her jaw clenched. I walked past them, the floorboards creaking beneath my steps, and stopped at the front door. My hand rested on the knob for a moment. I wanted to say more, to list every sacrifice, every late night, every dollar spent for them. But I knew it would not matter. They had already decided I no longer belonged. I stepped outside. The evening air in Springfield was cool and sharp, carrying the smell of cut grass and wood smoke. I drew it deep into my lungs. Behind me, their voices began again, low and tense, but I let the door close firmly between us. I stood on the porch and looked across the street. The sun was sinking behind the trees, stretching shadows long across the lawn. My chest still burned, but not from shame or sadness. It was something fiercer, a fire that had been smothered for years. They thought they had pushed me aside with a few words. They thought I would fade quietly into a smaller place away from the home I had built with my own two hands. I gripped the porch railing, the wood rough beneath my palm. For the first time in a long while, I felt steady. They had taken their stand. Now it was time for me to take mine. I stepped down onto the path leading away from the house. My stride was firm, each step carrying me farther from the weight of their judgment and closer to the decision forming in my mind. This was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning. I walked down the front path with the evening air in my lungs and the old oak throwing its shadow across the lawn. The year was 2010. The winter in Springfield had been sharp, and my shop smelled of pine and sweat. I had named it Coleman Custom Carpentry. By then, I had steady clients. I kept a notebook with sketches and a list for new machines I wanted. Michael was 20 and already talking like a lawyer. He had been accepted to Ohio State, and he wanted the dorm and the meal plan and the textbooks. "Dad," he said one afternoon in January, "the bursar needs the first tuition payment by Friday." Emily was 15 and in color guard, and she wanted a bus pass for practices. Laura kept the calendar on the refrigerator with little stars next to the due dates. I ran my hand over the lacquered edge of a maple island I was finishing for a client, and did the math again in my head. Tuition, housing fees, books. I could have taken a bank loan. I could have told Michael to work more hours at the campus coffee shop. I could have asked him to wait a semester. Instead, I locked up the shop early and drove to meet a broker in a small office above a title company on Limestone Street. The broker had a clean desk. He asked me why I was selling a going concern. I said I needed liquidity. He asked if I would consider seller financing. I said no, I needed a clean cut. He shook my hand when we agreed on a price. I told myself a father does not count the cost when his children are standing on the edge of their future. I told Laura that night at the kitchen table. She listened without interrupting. She said, "We will make it work, Rich. We will make it work." I nodded and looked at the calluses on my hands. The last week before closing, I was at the shop before dawn and home after dark. I sharpened every chisel. I labeled drawers for the new owner. On the morning of the closing, the title clerk slid a stack of papers to me. My name appeared in neat blocks. Richard A. Coleman. At the end, she handed me a cashier check and a receipt. I drove straight to the bank and deposited most of it, then took the short drive to the Ohio State branch office in Springfield to process the first transfer. A clerk took my form. She asked for identification. I wrote the amount carefully, making the numbers clear. She stamped a receipt and slid it back. When I got back to the house, Laura had already set 2 mugs on the counter. I told her the first term was now paid. She reached for my hand and squeezed it. We did not say much. Michael breezed in later. I told him the bursar had posted the payment and that there was money set aside for books. He checked his phone and nodded. Good, he said, that should cover it. And he asked if I could also transfer something for a laptop, because his old one lagged. That night I told myself he was busy and young, and that gratitude comes later after the thrill of freedom fades and the weight of love settles where it belongs. The next weeks were a blur. I trained the new owner on a few jobs I had promised to finish. I sorted my tools, kept a few for the garage, sold the rest. When I locked the door for the last time, it was early March, and the wind cut through my jacket. I slid the key into an envelope for the buyer and drove away. In the quiet of the truck, I said it again. This is for my children. Emily watched me more closely than Michael did. She came into the garage one afternoon with a roll of duct tape and asked if I could fix the handle on her practice case. She said she was proud of me. She asked if I missed the shop. I told her the truth, every minute. Then she hugged me and ran back to the yard. The second tuition bill came due in late summer. I moved money again. Michael texted me lists of required books and a request for a meal plan upgrade. I transferred more and told myself that next year he would find a part-time job to help. When I asked him about it, he said classes were heavy and the law track required focus. He added a line about internships and how unpaid work now would pay later. I sent another transfer instead. On a humid evening in August, I sat at the kitchen table with the last check for the semester in front of me. The house was quiet. Laura put a plate of cut peaches beside me. She said, "Finish it and come sit outside with me." I filled the date line, the pay to the memo. When I lifted the pen for the last signature, my hand hesitated. A father hopes that a signature can be a bridge between what he is and what his child can become. I wrote my name and felt the old ache in my wrist and closed the checkbook. 3 days later, Michael stopped by to pick up a stack of packages he had sent to the house. He said the money had hit his account. He said he needed to head back because the guys were waiting. He took a bottle of water from the fridge and walked toward the door. I caught his sleeve lightly and asked if he had everything he needed. He nodded without looking up. He said he was good. He said he would text me later with his schedule. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. I stood there, and I felt it for the first time. A small, cool space where warmth used to live. It was not anger. It was not disappointment, not yet. It was the knowledge that I had poured something deep and expensive into a well, and the surface had not moved. I picked up the cap and twisted it back on the bottle. I wiped the ring of water from the counter with the heel of my hand. The simple motions calmed me the way sanding calms a rough edge. That night, Laura and I sat on the porch and watched the street wash in the amber light of the lamps. She rested her head on my shoulder. She said, "You did right." I said, "I know." When we went inside, I put the last receipt in the file drawer labeled Education and closed it gently. The next morning, I woke before the sun and made coffee and stood in the doorway of the empty space in the garage where my greater plans had once lived. It was just concrete and a window and a hook for a work light. I told myself a new season had arrived. I told myself that sacrifice would grow a future big enough for all of us. I said the words out loud to see if they sounded true. The house answered with its familiar creaks. I poured a second cup and sat at the table and looked at the neat stack of receipts and bank slips and the small note Laura had left there in her tidy hand. "We will make it work." I placed my palm on the paper as if warmth could pass through it and back again. When the phone buzzed a little later with another message from Michael about a parking permit charge that was higher than expected, I opened the banking app and moved another small amount. The confirmation screen lit the room for a second and went dark. I set the phone down and listened to the house breathe. In that quiet, I felt the seed of something I could not yet name settle into the grain of my heart and stay there. Spring drifted into summer, and then into the year the doctors began using words that made the room colder. Laura started with a cough that would not shake loose. By February of 2018, we were taking the early drive to the clinic before sunrise. I kept my hands steady on the wheel. She kept her hands folded in her lap. We did not need many words. Tests led to more tests. I kept a small notebook in my pocket and wrote down every instruction. I asked questions, simple ones at first, then the kind that come when you realize the ground is moving beneath your feet. Emily came home from Columbus every weekend she could. She sat with Laura in the afternoons and read aloud from the paper. When Laura felt strong enough, they walked to the porch and watched the oak throw dappled shade on the grass. Michael called often at first. He asked about test results and medications, and then he asked about money. He said he could draw up papers to protect the house. He talked about trusts and transfer on death deeds and the way probate might slow everything down. He said selling might make sense in the long run. His voice was calm, persuasive, practiced. I said we would take it one step at a time. Some days Laura had the old light in her eyes and teased me for fussing over her blanket. Other days she slept through the afternoon and woke only to whisper for water. I learned which joke could still pull a smile when the room felt too heavy. The day the oncologist spoke plainly, he said the treatment had held as long as it could. He said we could fight longer, but the fight would be different now. Laura nodded. She reached for my hand first, and then for Emily's. Home hospice entered our lives with quiet competence and warm faces. I set up a bed by the window that looked toward the tree. Neighbors brought food and stories. Emily slept on the couch most nights and woke at every shift of air. Michael visited on a Saturday every few weeks and spoke to Laura softly for a few minutes. On one of those afternoons, he said we should consider a reverse mortgage. I nodded without nodding. On a clear morning in August, the house grew very still. Laura squeezed my hand, then Emily's. I pressed my forehead to hers and told her I would keep the house the way she liked it. I told her the porch would be swept. I told her the curtains would be washed in the first warm week of spring. Emily cried quietly into my shoulder. We stayed that way until the nurse touched my arm and whispered that she would make the necessary calls. After the funeral, Emily took charge of thank you notes and handed me a pen when a message needed my voice. Michael came by 2 days later in a pressed blue shirt and a tie I had bought him for his first job. He wanted to review some paperwork. He pointed to the deed and asked how it was titled. He asked about life insurance allocations and beneficiary designations. He asked whether I had considered retitling assets to simplify transfer. I listened and gave him answers where I could. He said something then that made the room tilt. He said that eventually the house would be his anyway, and that planning early would save us hassle. Emily turned and stared at him. She said, "This house is Mom's heart." He shrugged and said he was only being practical. I felt something inside me cool and harden. I kept the kitchen clean the way Laura liked it. Emily came by on Thursdays to walk with me. She told me about her unit at the hospital, about a patient who made the nurses laugh about how grief comes in waves and that it is fine to let it break. I said little. Michael's calls grew shorter. He sent links to articles about downsizing. He forwarded emails from a mortgage broker he knew in Dayton. He mentioned that a colleague could help set up a trust with him as trustee. When I did not respond the way he expected, he pivoted to other topics. He asked if I had considered selling the old truck. He said I could ride with him sometimes. On a chilly afternoon in October, I found myself in the garage. I opened the cabinet where I kept what was left of my tools and took out a small can of oil. The banister at the bottom of the stairs had dried out. Laura ran her hand along it every evening when she went up to bed. The work was simple. It was something I could do. Emily knocked and let herself in. She said it feels like the house is breathing again. She asked if Michael was coming for Sunday dinner. I said he had texted that he had to be in Cincinnati. She asked what I wanted to do with the boxes in the hall closet. We worked together folding and stacking. When she left, she hugged me tight and held on a second longer than usual. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and spread out the mail. A note from the church asked for volunteers at the winter coat drive. I read Michael's message twice. Perhaps he would not have said it so plainly if Laura had been in the room. Perhaps he would have said it anyway. I rested my hand on the table and looked at the smooth patch of wood Laura used to polish with a rag on Saturdays. I could hear her voice in my head reminding me to be patient, to be fair, to see the best first. I tried. I failed. The cool space I had felt on that afternoon in August widened enough for me to step inside and take a long look around. It was not anger. It was recognition. It was seeing my son clearly through the clean glass of grief and understanding that warmth does not return simply because you wish it would. By the time winter leaned into 2022, I kept busy out of habit. I repaired a loose gate latch for the Whitmans next door, and work kept thoughts in line. Then the calls started coming from Michael. He said a client payment was delayed and he needed a short bridge for a week. He said Karen had a dental bill that insurance had misprocessed. He said the interest rate on their card would gouge them if I did not step in. I transferred money from my savings and marked the notes in a small column in my ledger. Emily saw me writing one evening when she came by with rotisserie chicken and a bag of salad. "You are helping him again." I told her it was temporary. "Dad," she said softly, "there is a difference between an emergency and a pattern." I nodded and changed the subject to the weather. Spring brought longer light and more asks. He said the firm had moved him to a new team and that he needed to look the part. He needed help covering a suit and shoes he had already charged. I told him I would move the money. Karen visited with him 2 weekends in a row. She looked around the living room. When I poured coffee for all of us, she asked about the grinder. Later, she said she had been reviewing their budget and that they were concerned about my lack of a comprehensive plan. She said older parents often struggle to manage cash flow and investments. I told her I had managed fine. In May, Michael asked for help with a tax bill. The number was larger than the others. I moved the funds. Emily found me at the porch table 2 days later with the ledger. She asked if we could look at the numbers together. I slid the notebook to her. She said only, "This feels like more than a rough patch." I told her he had always been intense, always sure he could outwork a wall if he ran at it long enough. She said intensity is not the same as respect. I put my hand over hers on the table. The next ask came in June. Michael said they had an unexpected repair on the air and heat unit at their townhouse, and it was the hottest week yet. He sent me a link to the invoice. I paid it directly to the company. When I logged in, I saw a list of recent card charges I did not recognize. A boutique spa in Oakwood, a high-end kitchen store in downtown Dayton, a dinner at a steakhouse with a total that looked like a mortgage payment from 1987. My name was on the account. The card number matched the old supplemental I had added for emergency use when Michael was a senior at Ohio State, the one I had forgotten to cancel when he promised he would cut it up after graduation. For a minute, I just stared at the screen. I clicked through to see the authorization, and there it was. Michael Coleman as the user on the supplemental line. I pressed my palms on the edge of the table until the wood bit my skin. In that silence, I heard Laura say gently that feelings need facts and facts need action. I printed the list and walked outside. I walked to the end of the block and back, and then I dialed. Michael answered, breathless, as if he had jogged upstairs. I told him I was looking at the statement. I read 3 charges. There was a beat of silence, and then his voice came polished and quick. He said those were client-related, and he had planned to reconcile them with the firm. He said the spa was actually a gift card for a client referral, and the steak dinner was a meeting. He spoke too fast. I asked why he had used the supplemental card. He said his personal card had hit a temporary hold, that it was easier to fix it later that he meant to tell me. I asked when later was. He said soon. Karen called me an hour after that. She said I was misunderstanding how business works. She said a responsible parent would want their son to look successful because appearances matter in law. She suggested that Michael take over paying my bills for a while to ensure nothing fell through the cracks. I listened, said I would consider it, and hung up. Emily dropped by that evening with grocery store flowers and macaroni salad. I handed her the printed statement. She said we need to shut that card down. I said not yet. She asked me why. I told her sometimes you learn more by watching one more step. She said, I am with you in whatever you choose, and Dad, I will not let them steamroll you. 2 days later, another charge hit. A home goods store in Centerville for a set of bar stools. I did not call. I drove to Dayton with the printout and parked a block from their townhouse. I walked up the steps and knocked. Karen opened the door. Behind her, I saw the new stools at the kitchen island. Michael came out of the hallway in shirt sleeves, tie draped around his neck. I lifted the paper and held it between us. He looked at it, and then at me. You used my card, I said evenly without raising my voice. You did not ask. He opened his hands as if to show he was unarmed. He said it was temporary. He said he was going to move the funds tonight. He said I was making a bigger deal than necessary. Karen stood with her arms crossed and said if I kept reacting like this, people would think I was slipping. She said the adult solution was to let Michael manage my accounts. I folded the paper back into my pocket. I took a breath and let it out slowly. I told them I would review everything and be in touch. I turned and walked down the steps. Neither of them followed. On the drive back to Springfield, I did not turn on the radio. I let the miles roll under the tires and thought about lines and where to draw them. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the quiet no longer felt like absence. It felt like a room where a decision could finally take a seat. I went inside, set the printed list on the table, and reached for my ledger. The pen felt heavier than before. I wrote a single sentence across the top of a fresh page. Enough. Then I closed the book and listened to the house breathe. January brought a pale sun and a cold morning. I salted the walk. Inside, I made coffee. The doorbell rang just after 9. Through the glass, I saw Michael in a dark coat and Karen behind him. He said he had brought paperwork to make things easier. Karen brushed past and set her bag on the kitchen island. Michael asked if we could sit at the table. He began arranging pages into neat stacks. He said words like streamlining and peace of mind. I sat across from him and watched his hands. He slid the first packet toward me. He said this was a listing agreement with a friend in Columbus who specialized in properties like mine. He said the market would cool soon and that we should move quickly. Karen picked up the second stack. She said this was a transition plan, a soft name for moving me out of the house and into their townhouse until they found a suitable condo near them. She laid out the benefits as if reading from a brochure. I let their voices flow past for a minute. Michael tapped a line on the listing agreement. He said this was the price range the agent expected and how that would translate into cash after fees and taxes. He said he could set up a trust to manage the proceeds. He did not use the word father. I lifted the top page and read enough to see dates and clauses that were already filled with my name. Richard, a Coleman. My stomach tightened at the sight of my own name used as a tool. I set the page down. Karen said the house was too much for me now. She said the porch needed work, the roof would not last another winter, and that the furnace was ancient. She added that older adults often cling to houses for sentimental reasons and then end up paying more in repairs. She suggested that I was on the verge of making poor decisions. She said Michael and she had the bandwidth to take care of things in a modern way. I folded my hands so I would not drum my fingers on the table. I told them both that I appreciated the thought, but I was not signing anything today. He said the point was to act before a crisis. He said I was alone in a 4-bedroom house and that loneliness was dangerous. He said people take advantage and that I was lucky to have children who were proactive. He said it was time to be practical. Karen said I should accept that I was old and that it was best to live with them for a while. She added that managing money can get confusing at my stage and that she already saw signs I was out of my depth. The room went very still. I wished Laura could step in from the yard, wipe her hands on a dish towel, and tell them to lower their voices in her kitchen. Emily had warned me about patterns, the asks that became assumptions, the assumptions that became expectations. I thought of the supplemental card charges and the way the bar stools had gleamed under the townhouse lights. I thought of the sentence Michael had once said softly after Laura died, that the house would be his eventually. I felt the old cool place in my chest expand just enough to give me space to think clearly. I stood and walked to the sink. I turned and leaned my hips against the counter. I told them again that I was not signing anything and that the house would remain mine. I said the roof would be handled when needed and that my knees were not their business. My voice was calm. Karen said I was being stubborn and ungrateful. She said they were trying to save me from myself. She said I had already shown I do not manage accounts well, pointing vaguely toward the room with my desk. She said Michael had been picking up my slack for months and that he was tired. Michael put both hands flat on the table. He said if I refused to sign now, it would only drag out the inevitable. He said there were legal paths to make sure assets were managed in the family interest. He said he would prefer not to go that route. I told him to pick up the papers. He did not move. She said I was just being dramatic. She said I had always wanted to be the hero of a story that did not exist. She said I had been a burden for years and that I should stop pretending otherwise. Something in me that had been patient for a long time stood up. I walked back to the table and picked up the listing agreement. I set it down across the stacks. I looked at my son and said I would not be bullied in my own kitchen. I told him that guardianship was not a club to swing at a parent. I told him to leave the papers or take them, but that my decision would not change. He stared at me for a long moment. The air between us felt like a courtroom that had emptied, but the verdict had not yet been read. He glanced at Karen. She gave the smallest nod. He squared his shoulders the way he did when addressing a jury. He said the sentence he had been carrying for months. "Dad, you don't belong here anymore." The words did not surprise me. They landed like a hammer on a nail already set. The house did not shake. The oak outside did not bend. The only movement was a small shift inside me where grief lives beside pride, and both learned something new about endurance. I did not answer him right away. I picked up the pen he had placed in front of me and clicked it once. The sound was sharp, final, familiar. I set the pen down and walked to the doorway. I told them both to see themselves out. Michael gathered the papers with more force than necessary. He slipped the pen back into the folder as if that would take back the click. At the door, Michael paused. He said I was making a mistake that would hurt everyone. He said I was forcing his hand. I held the door open. He waited for me to speak. I did not. He stepped onto the porch. Karen followed. I closed the door gently, and the latch caught with the small sound I have heard 1,000 times after a family dinner or a Sunday night. I stood with my back against the wood and let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting for years. The kitchen was still bright. The table was slightly askew. I straightened it. I put the extra chairs back where they belonged. I wiped a faint coffee ring from the island and tossed the cloth into the sink. Simple motions to steady the room. Through the window, I watched their car pull away. The street returned to its ordinary quiet. A mower started 2 houses over and then stopped. I turned off the coffee maker and listened as the last drip hit the burner. Then I walked to the desk, opened the drawer with the file folders, and took out a blank pad. The first page felt rough under my hand. I wrote 3 words slowly until the ink settled into the paper. Not for sale. I set the pad beside the ledger and looked out at the yard where the oak reached into a pale winter sky. The house breathed around me, patient and alive, and I let the stillness gather before the next call I knew I would have to make. I stood at the window until the car was gone. The house held me steady, and in that stillness, Laura stepped into my mind. Keep the house rich. It is the heart of this family. I took out the small address book we had kept in the top drawer. Nathan Carter was right where he had always been under C for Carter, though I had penciled an N in the margin years ago so I could find him faster. I dialed and listened to the old ring. He answered on the 3rd beat and said my name. I told him the short version. My son had brought papers to sell the house. He had pushed hard. I had said no, until then he said we would handle it. He said we start with the basics. He said I needed to pull copies of the deed, the title insurance policy, from when Laura and I refinanced the roof years back, the homeowner policy, and any powers of attorney I might have signed after the funeral when I was tired, and saying yes to keep the world from shaking. He told me to gather bank statements, credit cards. I found a yellow legal pad and wrote a list. Deed, title, insurance, bank statements, credit cards, beneficiaries. I pulled the metal file box from the hall closet and set it on the table. The lock slid open. Inside were the careful folders Laura had labeled in her tidy hand. Taxes, house, vehicles, education. I added a new tab with a blank label and wrote estate, and then under that I wrote today. The deed was in the house folder behind copies of the survey with its neat little drawing of our yard. The title policy was stapled to a letter from the lender. I set those in a stack. I found the homeowner policy and the last premium receipt. In the banking folder, I found the original paperwork for the supplemental card I had once added for Michael. I set it aside with a paperclip. I needed a plan. Nathan called back before I could ring him again. He said he had cleared his afternoon. He said to bring everything to his place in the old brick building off Market Street. I told him I would be there by 2. I drove through Springfield, Nathan met me at the door. He hugged me, then stepped back to see if anything was broken that could be fixed. We spread the papers out on his dining table. He nodded at the deed and title. He lifted the supplemental card form and looked at me over his glasses. I told him I had already decided to shut that down. He said, "Good." He said, "Do it today." He asked about beneficiaries on my bank accounts. I told him they were old. He said we would refresh everything. He asked about my will. I told him it was a simple document from years ago and that it had not been touched since Laura died. He did not scold. A new will, a revocable living trust if we decided it fit. Pay on death designations for accounts. A transfer on death designation. Affidavit for the house if that made sense given the trust. A healthcare proxy and a durable power of attorney with strict limits and clear triggers. We talked through people. He asked about Emily. I told him she was steady and kind, and that she understood the house better than anyone alive because she had watched Laura love it. He asked about Michael. I said Michael was brilliant and relentless, and that he had learned to use those traits on the wrong battles. He said trustees need steadiness and beneficiaries need boundaries. He asked if I wanted to leave the house directly to a person or shelter it in a trust that would pass benefit without allowing a sale out from under the purpose Laura had named. I saw the porch in my mind, Laura's book, on the arm of the chair, Emily laughing with Sophie as bubbles rose and popped in the yard. I said the house should stay in the family, but not be treated like a piggy bank. He nodded and said then we would draft language that any sale required unanimous consent of 2 trustees, and that proceeds stayed in trust for a purpose that fit our intent. He said also we would add a clause that barred any trustee who had a documented history of misusing the settlers' funds from serving without court review. He knew I had to say the next part myself. I said Emily would serve. I said Michael would not. He wrote the names neatly. We paused and he said next was banking. He told me to go to the bank in the morning and remove every authorization not strictly necessary. He told me to ask for a printout of all users and access points. He said to replace the supplemental card with nothing. He said, while I was there, to ask for beneficiary forms and to name who I intended with full legal names and social security numbers, no room for confusion. He said to get a safe deposit box for original documents. He said to keep receipts and write dates in the corner in ink. I thought about calling Michael to tell him to back off. I thought about telling Emily to come sit with me and draft 1,000 lists. I looked at the stack of papers, the neat columns of dates, the way Nathan's notes already made a map. I heard Laura again. Keep the house. The sentence did not sound like nostalgia. It sounded like instruction. I told Nathan I would do all of it, and that I would do it quietly. He asked if I wanted him to call Michael as a courtesy to head off a confrontation. I shook my head. I said not yet. He nodded and underlined a date on his pad. We gathered the folders. He offered to walk me through wording for anything a banker might push back on. He told me what to say if someone suggested a joint account for convenience or asked to add a manager. He said, say no and repeat it plainly. He said if the teller wanted a reason, I should say safeguarding. He said if the manager wanted a reason, I should say counsel advises. I set the file box on the desk and took out a small black notebook Laura had given me the Christmas before she got sick. The first pages were blank. I wrote a date and then wrote bank beneficiaries safe deposit P.O. box. I wrote attorney will draft trust draft healthcare proxy power of attorney with limits. I wrote deed review and decide whether to file transfer on death affidavit after trust is complete. I ate a simple supper and washed the plate. I walked the rooms with a quiet kind of inventory. The nick in the hallway where Michael had run a toy truck too fast. The scuff on the baseboard Laura never minded. The sun stain where her favorite rug had faded into a soft memory. I stopped at the porch and touched the rail I had oiled in the fall. It felt like the house breathing against my palm. The phone buzzed once with a message from Michael asking if I had reconsidered. I set the phone face down. He would learn the difference soon enough. I shut the curtains and locked the back door. I slid the file box under the desk and set my wallet and keys beside the checklist so nothing would slow me in the morning. In the quiet, I said a few words to Laura. Then I turned off the lamp and let the house rest, knowing that by the time the bank opened, the first nails of this new frame would already be set. Morning light pressed through the curtains, and I was already at the kitchen table with the checklist Nathan had drawn for me. A car door shut out front. I looked up and saw Emily on the walk with a paper bag in one hand and Sophie beside her. Emily called through the door. She stepped in and set the bag on the counter. "I am here, Dad," she said. Sophie came straight at me. "Grandpa," she said into my sweater, "don't let them take your house." The words lodged in my chest. I bent and held her. I told her I was not going anywhere. She let me go and stood back and announced that she had brought her markers. Emily handed me a pack of blueberry muffins and set out plates. While Sophie rummaged for her markers, Emily rested a hand on my shoulder. "Michael texted me," she said. "He said he came by yesterday with papers. He said you were stubborn." I told her what had happened. I told her about the listing agreement already filled with my name about Karen, about the sentence Michael had rehearsed. Emily listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded. "We will not let them do this." Sophie tugged at my sleeve and asked if she could sit on the porch to draw the oak. I wrapped a scarf around her neck and followed her outside. The air had winter clarity, and the tree stood against the pale sky like a guardian. Sophie sat cross-legged on the boards and started to trace the trunk. She said Grandma loved this tree, and I said yes, she did. She said then we will love it for her. I sat on the step and watched her sketch. Inside, Emily poured coffee. "Tell me your plan," she said. I slid the checklist toward her. Bank visit, beneficiaries, safe deposit, attorney drafts. She read each line and nodded. She asked if I wanted company to the bank. I told her I might need her later, but today I wanted to do the first steps alone. She said then we will double-check the forms together tonight. Sophie finished her first drawing and ran in to show us. She had written one word under the trunk in careful letters. Home. I taped her drawing to the refrigerator where Laura used to put school papers. Sophie asked if she could do a second one from the kitchen window. I told her to pick the best view. Emily and I carried the file box to the table. She asked about the supplemental card, and I told her I planned to shut it down. She said good, and then added that we should print copies of every recent statement and keep a log of calls. The doorbell rang, and both of us froze. I went to the window and saw only the mail carrier leaving a package on the porch. I exhaled and felt the house relax with me. I carried the box inside. Sophie asked if she could open it. I said yes, and she pulled out a set of garden bulbs Emily had ordered a week ago. We pulled on jackets and went to the small bed along the south fence. The soil gave easily under the trowel. Sophie placed each bulb. Emily brushed a curl from her face and smiled. I thought of Laura's sentence, "Keep the house," and knew that she would have approved of this small act of faith with our hands in the earth. Back inside, Emily wiped her palms on a towel and said we should talk about Michael. She said he would not back down on his own. She said he would likely escalate when silence did not give him the result he expected. She said she would call him not to argue, but to tell him clearly that he had crossed a line and that I was not alone. I said, "Do what you think is right." She nodded. Sophie wandered in and asked if we could bake something that made the house smell like Grandma. Emily smiled and went to the cabinet where Laura kept her recipe box. She pulled out the card for oatmeal cookies and set it on the counter. Sophie cracked eggs with intense concentration, and I creamed butter and sugar. Emily measured flour. While the first tray baked, Emily made the call in the dining room. I heard only her steady voice. She stated facts. She said Dad is not selling. She said stop using his name and his accounts. She said, if you push, we will push back. She returned to the kitchen. He hung up on me, she said. He will be back. We will be ready. The timer dinged and I pulled the tray from the oven. Sophie cheered. We let the cookies cool and then ate 2 each, standing at the counter. Sophie leaned into me. She said again, Grandpa, don't let them take your house. I put my arm around her. Emily looked at the checklist again, and then at the refrigerator where Sophie's drawing hung. She reached for my hand and squeezed once. We are with you, she said, all the way. I felt something in me shift from private resolve to a shared plan. We cleared the counter and rinsed the bowls. Sophie packed 2 cookies in a napkin for the road and tucked a third into her backpack. Emily gathered her scarf and keys and then hesitated. Do you want us to stay tonight? She asked. I thought of the morning ahead. Stay for supper, I said, and then go. I will sleep better knowing we stood together today. We ate simple and talked about Sophie's spelling bee and the coat drive at church and a neighbor who had built a ramp for his wife after her knee surgery. When the dishes were done and the porch light clicked on, Emily kissed my cheek and told me to call if anything shifted. Sophie hugged me, then ran back for a second hug. They waved from the car, and I stood on the steps until the taillights turned the corner. I walked to the refrigerator and touched the edge of Sophie's drawing. Home. I stood there a long moment and let the word become a decision. Then I set the coffee pot for morning, placed the checklist by my keys, and turned off the kitchen light. The rooms settled around me. I woke before the alarm and brewed coffee in the dark, then dressed carefully. The list sat by my keys. Bank beneficiaries, safe deposit, 2-factor revocations. I slid the file folder into a canvas bag. The lobby at First Franklin on Limestone opened at 9. Jeff Sanders stood from his desk when he saw me coming. He shook my hand and asked how I was. I told him I needed to clean house. We sat in his office and I set the folder on the desk. I said I wanted a printout of every account under my name, including any authorized users, joint holders, and any powers of attorney on file. He clicked his keyboard and handed me the first stack and a pen. We went line by line. Checking ending in 2147 savings, ending in 9013, and the old credit line tied to the house. Then the list of card users. There it was in plain type. Supplemental user, Michael Coleman. Jeff said we can remove the user immediately and issue a new card number for the main account. He asked if I wanted to set daily limits. I told him yes, but for me only. He began to type forms and turn screens for signatures. Next, we pulled up the section for authorizations. There was a single sheet scanned after Laura passed. Jeff said it was limited, but sloppy. I said, make it gone. He printed a revocation form and I signed it and watched him scan and click. We added a note to require government identification and a code word for any future in-person requests. I chose a word Laura used to say when she wanted me to stop worrying. Enough. 2-factor authentication was next. Jeff took me through each login and set it to text my phone. He told me to harden my email and phone carrier too. I wrote carrier on my own list. We opened beneficiary forms for my checking and savings. He handed me the forms and a blue pen. I wrote Emily Coleman's full name and address, and then Sophie Coleman as contingent. Jeff checked the forms and said he would walk them to the back himself so they were keyed before lunch. The safe deposit box clerk brought a small brass key and a ledger. We signed and she showed me to the vault. I chose a mid-sized drawer. In it, I placed photocopies of the deed and title policy, the insurance, and the list Nathan had made. I kept the originals with me for now, and a second set would go to Nathan. Back at Jeff's desk, he printed one more report. We scanned it together. Then an entry caught my eye. A small installment loan opened online in late fall, just $3,000. The electronic signature line listed my full name and an email address that was mine, but the recovery phone number was not. I pointed. Jeff frowned. He said it could be a clerical input by the lender or an application done by someone with enough of my information. He printed the page and suggested we bring it to the lender branch across town and request the application packet. I tucked the printout into my folder. I thanked him, and he walked me to the door. He said if anyone asks for information about you, they get nothing. He tapped the code word on his pad. I said it back to him. Enough. He said, call me if anything smells off. I will flag your profile for extra verification. The handshake was firm. I drove straight to Nathan's building. He waved me in. The dining table was cleared. I laid out the bank paperwork and the beneficiary forms and told him about the supplemental card removal and the revocation. He had drafted outlines for a will and a revocable living trust. We talked through intent first. The house stays in trust for family use, no sale without the consent of the trustees. Emily to serve as primary trustee. Michael to be a beneficiary, but not a trustee. Sophie to receive educational support from the trust. We turned to the will, moving anything left outside into the trust on my death. We set healthcare directives and a durable power of attorney. Nathan read each clause slowly. I stopped him twice to ask for plainer words. I showed him the small loan printout. His mouth flattened. He said, if Michael used my name with implied permission from the old days, the bank might treat it as a domestic misunderstanding rather than fraud. He said we could pull the application file and demand the IP and device info. He said we could also treat it as a warning. We chose quiet with a record. He drafted a letter for me to send to the lender, requesting all application materials and adding a note that no one is authorized to apply on my behalf for any future product. By late afternoon, the drafts sat before me, lines ready for signatures once I took a night to breathe and read them again. Nathan pulled a notary stamp from a drawer and set it aside. He asked me how I felt. Steady, I said. We both laughed once, short and real. Back home, the sun had shifted to the west windows. I spread the drafts on the dining table and read them one more time. Emily trustee, Sophie beneficiary, the house not for sale. I signed where Nathan had marked for preliminary approval and set the stack in a large envelope. I placed it by the door with the safe deposit key on top. I called the lender branch and asked for the packet on the small loan. The clerk said the file would be ready the next day. I noted the time and her name on the edge of my legal pad. Then I sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a column of all the small skills that had kept this house upright. Patch a roof, replace a seal, plane a sticking door. I wrote them and felt my breath slow. The phone buzzed once. A text from Michael asking if I had reconsidered. Another followed from Karen suggesting a family meeting. I set the phone face down on the table and listened as the furnace kicked on and the vents breathed warm air into the rooms. I put the signed drafts back in the envelope, slid the safe deposit key into my wallet, and turned off the kitchen light. For the first time in years, my finances were under no one's hand but mine. I stood at the window and watched the street in the blue hour, and let that truth fill me until it felt like a foundation that would hold. The street lights flicked off one by one. I had a second cup of coffee and reviewed the envelope by the door. My phone buzzed on the counter. A fraud alert showed a declined charge at a boutique spa in Oakwood at 7:42. Another buzz followed with a decline at a high-end home store minutes later. By late morning, a car pulled hard to the curb. Michael came up the walk fast. I opened before the third hit on the door. He shouldered past me a step, and then stopped when I did not move. He said his card was declined, and that I had humiliated him in front of people who matter. He said a manager had looked at him like a liar, and that he had to pay with cash he did not plan to use. I told him the supplemental card was gone, and the number changed. I told him any use of my name or accounts without permission would now meet a closed gate. He stepped closer and said I had overreacted to a simple delay, and that I had no idea how reputation works in his line of work. He said he was building relationships and that I had just made him look small. Karen appeared in the doorway behind him. She said we needed to sit down and make adult decisions. She said I had always been stubborn and that now it was turning dangerous. She said she and Michael had looked into guardianship options for elders who resist help, and that the courts could be reasonable if presented with a clear record of poor choices. I said we can talk on the porch. He looked at me for a long second, then walked back outside. Karen followed. Michael started again. He said I had cut him off without warning and that I was jeopardizing the family. He said if I insisted on clinging to this old place, then every expense would be on me, and that he would not bail me out when the roof failed or the furnace died. He said selling was still the rational option. I told him I was not asking him for anything. I told him I had revoked all authorizations and added protections, and that any misstep with my accounts would now be a matter of record. I said law does not stand with the greedy. Karen cut in. She said I was throwing around words I do not understand. She said if I continued this behavior, they would file for guardianship and power of attorney and have me evaluated. I told her to put any threats in writing and address them to my counsel. Michael said he knew about a small loan under my name because he had seen a soft pull on a monitoring service. He said he was concerned I was losing track. That was his attempt to get ahead of it. I told him I had already requested the application packet, and that any misuse would be handled through channels. I said again that he was not to use my name for any application, and that the era of assumptions was over. He stepped closer. He said, "Dad, I am trying to help you. People take advantage of men your age. Scammers call. You give out numbers. You fall for phishing." I said I know the difference between a scam and a son with a sense of entitlement. Karen said this could all be simple. Sign the listing. Move in with us for a while. Let Michael handle the accounts. She said we could throw in the remodel you have put off for years at our place and you could have the downstairs room. I told her I will die in this house before I live under your rules. Michael flinched. He said I was being dramatic and ungrateful. He said everything he had ever done was for this family. He said he had carried me more than I know. He demanded to know what changes I had made. He wanted details. He said he had a right to information because he was my son. I told him being a son gives you a chance to earn trust. He said he would go to court. He said he would show the judge how unreasonable I had become, and how unsafe this house was for a man my age. The argument spiraled and then settled into a tight circle. He repeated his warnings. I repeated my decisions. She said my memory seemed faulty. She said I had always been better with wood than numbers. She said it was time to hand the wheel to younger hands. I thought of Emily and Sophie planting bulbs. Finally, Michael straightened and looked at his watch. He said he would handle this his way then. He said I had forced his hand. He said I would regret turning my own son into an opponent. He took a step down and turned. He said he would bring me to heel. He said I had no idea what I was up against. He said he would take me apart piece by piece if that is what it took. Karen gave me a little smile that did not reach her eyes. She said we will talk soon. They walked to the car. The engine started, and they pulled away too fast for a quiet street. I sat at the table and pulled the legal pad toward me. I wrote the date and the time and a short account of what had been said. Then I listed the next steps. Call Nathan to summarize and to put him on notice for possible filings. Pick up the loan packet from the lender. Add a camera at the porch. Ask Jeff at the bank to add an extra verbal step on in-person withdrawals. Copy beneficiary forms and store one set in the safe deposit box. My phone buzzed again, and I let it go. I turned the phone face down and wrote one more line. Do not engage by text. Require everything in writing to counsel. I stood and went to the window. Across the street, Mrs. Whitman wrestled a trash can lid into place and waved without knowing she had. The oak cast a lattice of shadow on the grass. I placed my palm on the glass and felt the cool press back. Then I turned toward the hallway, where my coat hung, picked up the envelope by the door, and stepped into the steady light of a day that had already chosen its direction. I walked down the church steps with the envelope still in my coat pocket, the morning sun breaking through a thin veil of clouds. It felt like the air itself had shifted, as if the world had been waiting for me to move and finally exhaled once I did. By the time I reached the sidewalk, I could already see neighbors watching me from across the street, their faces carrying that uneasy mix of curiosity and sympathy. Word travels fast, in Springfield, faster than anyone admits, and I knew before long the whole town would know about the fight inside my family. At the grocery store 2 days later, I felt it in the way Mrs. Delaney looked at me. She was usually all chatter about her grandchildren, but now her smile faltered and her hand lingered too long on the change she passed me. Behind me, someone whispered, their voice pitched just low enough to make me strain. He got thrown out of his own house. The words stung, though not because they weren't true, but because they carried the gleeful weight of gossip. Emily called that night. Dad, they're saying awful things at the PTA. Karen's been talking to anyone who'll listen, telling them you've lost your grip, that you don't know what you're doing. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone pressed to my ear and let her words wash over me. My daughter's loyalty cut deeper than any rumor. I don't care what they say, Emily told me, her voice fierce in a way that reminded me of her mother. I know the truth, and I'll say it out loud if I have to. The following Sunday at Springfield Baptist, she did exactly that. The fellowship hall was full after service people carrying paper plates loaded with casseroles and slices of pie, their voices rising in the familiar hum of small-town conversation. I sat near the coffee urn nursing a styrofoam cup when Emily stood by the piano and cleared her throat. Her daughter Sophie clung to her hand wide-eyed, sensing something serious. I want to say something. Emily began, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. Many of you have heard stories about my father, about what's happening in our family. Karen and Michael have said things that aren't true, things meant to shame him. I watched the room still itself the way prairie grass stills when a storm front moves in. My father is not a burden, she went on. He sacrificed for us for decades, and Michael has been trying to take from him what isn't his. There was a murmur, a shifting of feet. Someone dropped a fork. Emily's chin lifted. I won't stand by while my brother and his wife tell lies. My dad deserves respect, not rumors. Sophie tugged free from her hand and ran straight to me, throwing her arms around my waist. "Don't let them take your house, Grandpa," she whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. I felt the sting in my eyes before I could stop it, the warmth of her small arms wrapped tight, as if her belief alone could anchor me. Then the twist came sudden and sharp. From the back of the hall, old Mr. Patterson, who had worked 30 years at the county office, raised his voice. "I seen Michael myself," he said, his voice gravelly but clear. "Seen him behind the bank on Oak Street taking an envelope from a man in a suit. Didn't look right." He caught the eyes of everyone staring and added, "Thought maybe it was business, but now I'm not so sure." The room rippled like someone had dropped a stone into calm water. Michael had built his reputation on being responsible, upright, the man who followed rules. To hear a respected neighbor question that image was more than gossip. It was a spark to dry timber. Karen, standing near the serving table, flushed crimson and tried to laugh it off. "That's ridiculous," she snapped, but no one laughed with her. By the time the church council met the next evening, the whispers had become questions. Pastor Graham called me into the office first. "Richard," he said gently, "you've been a part of this congregation longer than I've been alive. Folks are concerned." I leaned forward, my palms flat on the desk. "Concerned about what, Pastor? About who's telling the truth?" His eyes didn't waver. "Emily's testimony, Mr. Patterson's claim, Michael's denials. People want clarity." In the fellowship hall, the council sat in a row of folding chairs, and the room filled with townsfolk who rarely missed a chance to weigh in on scandal. Karen perched beside Michael, her mouth tight, her hand gripping his arm as though she could keep him from slipping. Emily stood on the opposite side, Sophie beside her, both of them facing the crowd with a calm that seemed borrowed from somewhere beyond themselves. Michael tried to start with a speech about family privacy, about respect for boundaries, but the words slid off the room like oil on water. Questions came hard and fast. "Why were the credit cards in your father's name? Why did he pay your mortgage? What about the envelope behind the bank?" His voice cracked under the weight of it all. "That was nothing," he stammered, "just a personal matter." But the faces staring back at him were no longer sympathetic. They were skeptical, even cold. I waited until the noise subsided. Then I spoke. "The law does not stand with the greedy," I said slowly, making sure my words reached every corner of the hall. "It stands with truth, with sacrifice, with those who do right, even when it costs them." My son has forgotten that. Karen bristled, her eyes flashing, but Michael could not meet my gaze. For the first time in years, the ground beneath me felt steady, Emily at my side, Sophie's small hand clutching mine, and the community watching as truth cracked open the mask my son had worn. The questions kept coming sharper, more pointed, until Michael lowered his head. His reputation, once untouchable, had begun to unravel in front of everyone who mattered. And as the murmurs grew, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't alone anymore. Winter thinned into January. I met Nathan to sign the final pages of the trust, and Will filed the copies. The loan packet from the lender arrived. Nathan told me we would keep it documented and quiet, unless we needed it loud. By late February, the whisper that began in our fellowship hall reached Dayton. Emily called and said she had heard from a woman whose brother worked at Brackett and Miles. She said the firm had opened an internal review. I stood with the phone pressed to my ear. In March, I saw Michael only in glimpses, once from across a parking lot, another time from my porch, when his car rolled past too quickly for the street, Karen staring straight ahead. The letter came to him in April. Later, Emily confirmed it. He was terminated for cause after a findings meeting. The firm had chosen clean over loyal. Karen lasted 2 more weeks. I watched the moving truck back into their drive. Michael tried to lift a heavy box. The driver shut the truck door with a metal bang, and Karen climbed into the passenger seat without looking back. The car that he loved sat in the driveway for days. A tow truck came one morning and took it without hurry. I put the cup on the rail and watched the chain tighten and the car roll into place. He came to my door once after that in May. I saw him through the glass. He said he needed a small bridge just to keep his place until he found footing. He said he was interviewing at a firm in Cincinnati. I told him calmly that any requests would go through counsel. He said I was choosing Emily over him. I said I was choosing boundaries over noise. Then he turned and left. In June, he called. He said he had applied for a line of credit, and the bank had questions about a previous small loan linked to my name. He asked if I had started something to make him look bad. I told him not to use my name for anything, and to speak to Nathan if he had concerns. He texted a half apology that tried to sound like an explanation. I did not answer. I wrote the date and time and the gist of it in my notebook. By midsummer, his lawn grew shaggy. Mrs. Whitman left a plate of cookies at his doorstep, and it went untouched. The church prayer list held his name at the bottom with a line that said, "Employment and direction." Emily said she had seen him at a hardware store grabbing shifts. Karen did not come back. Word floated through the quiet channels that she had opened her own account and moved what remained of their savings. I did not add to it. I kept my porch swept and my ledger tidy. In August, I found Michael on the church steps after an evening meeting. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked past me at the darkening street. He said without preface that they would not take him back. He said the letter from Brackett and Miles meant other firms would not touch him for a year. I told him I hoped he would use the time to think about what led him here. He said he had nothing to think about except rent. He asked again for money. I told him no. The words fell like small stones at my feet. In September, a notice went up in the church bulletin that the stewardship committee had moved to a new treasurer. Michael's name did not appear on any committee. The pastor preached a sermon on humility. He shook my hand at the door after service. Emily kept bringing Sophie on Sundays. They sat with me. After service, Emily asked me how I was sleeping. She asked whether Michael had been in touch. I told her yes and no, that he had reached out, but the words were not the kind that build. She nodded. October put a crisp edge on the air. I raked leaves into low hills, and Sophie jumped through them. Emily baked a pie in my oven. In a quiet moment, I stood at the window and saw Michael walk past on the far sidewalk. His coat was thin. His hair needed a trim. He did not look up. I did not call out. I wish I could say I felt relief. I did not. What I felt was something like a long breath, the kind a carpenter takes after a board splits, and he knows he must cut a new piece rather than force the broken one into place. I set my hand on the porch rail and let its smoothness steady me. By November, the first hard frost silvered the yard, and the church choir rehearsed carols. Inside, I folded a letter from the lender, confirming that the loan in my name was closed without penalty, and that future applications would require in-person verification with identification. Nathan had underlined a sentence on the copy he kept and wrote good in the margin. I saw Michael last on a Wednesday after Thanksgiving near dusk. He stood outside the strip mall laundromat with a plastic bag in one hand. A cold wind moved down limestone, and he turned his face into it. He did not see me. I watched a moment longer than I should have, and then crossed to my truck. I sat with my hands on the wheel, and let a sigh escape that felt older than both of us. Not triumph. Not pity exactly. A surrender to the truth that a son can build his own ruin plank by plank even if you taught him better. I drove home in the early dark and parked by the oak. The house glowed in the front windows. I carried in the mail and set it on the table, turned on the kettle, and listened to the rooms breathe. The season had turned, and the year had done what years do, carving its mark on everything it touched. I stood in the doorway and watched steam rise then fade, and knew that some losses are simply the shape of a lesson finishing its work. Spring arrived in a new address in a town that felt like a held breath finally let go. Asheville in the morning carried a clean light that slid over the Blue Ridge and into my small apartment above the shops on Haywood Road. I learned the sounds of this place the way you learn the sounds of a loved one sleeping. Footsteps on the stairs at 7. A bus sighing at the corner. Laughter from the sidewalk when the bakery doors opened and heat and sugar met the air. Then I walked downstairs and joined it. Shirley Bennett ran the bakery like a conductor leads a band. The first time I stopped in, she slid a cinnamon roll onto a plate and said, "You look like a man who knows the value of early." I told her old habits keep their promises. She laughed and put a second roll in a bag for later and said, "Bring your granddaughter when she visits, and I will hide an extra for her." After that, I came most mornings. Sometimes I took my coffee to the corner table by the window and watched the street lift itself into the day. Ben Puon at the bookstore set aside a woodworking memoir he thought I would like. Lila at the plant shop said a north window would keep a fern honest. A retired teacher named Howard played chess on the bench by the bus stop and lost with grace and won without a speech. I did not have to justify my choices or defend my quiet. I simply showed up. That was enough to be known. Emily and Sophie arrived in April when the dogwoods were showing white and the hills wore a soft green that makes people slow down without knowing why. I met them at the station, and Sophie ran the last few steps with her backpack, bumping each stride. Emily hugged me hard and long, and when she stepped back, she studied my face the way a nurse studies a chart, and said, "You look rested." We carried their bags up the stairs and filled the apartment with the sounds I had missed. A kettle beginning to sing. Sophie found the balcony and declared it perfect for a tiny garden. We bought a bag of soil and small pots from Lila and planted basil and mint and a tomato that promised fruit if we promised water. She lined the pots like soldiers and gave each one a name. Emily told me about her unit and a new nurse from Cincinnati who already knew how to make a difficult family breathe easier. I told her about the chess games and the book Ben had saved for me, and the way Shirley had a sixth sense for when a man needed conversation more than glaze. One evening we sat on the balcony with simple plates balanced on our knees and watched the roof lines lift into dusk. Emily asked about Springfield, the old neighbors, the church, the oak. I told her the house stood as it should, and that the trust papers held like good joinery. I told her she and Sophie were named exactly where Laura would have wanted them, and that nothing important would be sold because Hurry had asked for it. Emily nodded and rested her hand on my arm for a long, quiet minute. "I kept my promise to your mother," I said, and the words felt like a board cut true at last. Sophie drew the oak from memory in the margin of a bakery bag and taped it to my refrigerator with the serious pride only a child can sustain. She said the real one misses you, but the drawing will watch you sleep. I told her I believed her. Later she fell asleep on the couch with a book on her chest, and the city humming below like a lullaby, written for old men and small girls who both needed rest. Emily covered her with a light blanket, and we crossed the room with the hush of people who remember a house where not everyone is sleeping anymore. The days folded into a rhythm that made sense, Mornings at the bakery, a walk by the river, a repair here and there for a neighbor who learned I still liked the feel of a screwdriver in my hand. The work was small and clean and kind. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see a man reduced by age. I saw a craftsman with fewer tools and more patience. That felt like an honest trade. Sometimes memory slid in beside me without warning. In the grocery aisle where Laura once teased me about the brand of mustard I refused to abandon. In the corner of the bakery, when Shirley wiped a table with the same efficient circle Laura used on Saturdays. On Sunday mornings when the bell of a church a few blocks over rang with a tone that matched the one in Springfield, in a way that made my chest ache and settle at the same time. News from Ohio arrived in small, careful notes. Emily kept me informed without trying to bind me to the past. Michael was quiet. He picked up hours here and there. He had not reached out lately. The church had met its coat drive goal. Mrs. Whitman had a new great-grandson and named him after her father. I listened and held each fact the way you hold a tool you have used for years, respectfully, without need to prove anything. One afternoon, Shirley asked if I could look at a bench leg that had loosened in the bakery. I brought a small kit and tightened the bolt and added a shim to the mortise. She watched my hands and said, "There you go, then the world holds again." I could not have put it better. As I stood to leave, she tucked a paper bag into my palm and said, "For your girls." I let the words settle in a place that had been empty. Summer tipped toward fall, and the mountains took on that deep blue only a handful of places can earn. On the last evening of their visit, Emily and Sophie and I walked the ridge above town, where the sky keeps its promises. I squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back. We stood in a line looking out at the soft, dark hills, and for a moment, I could feel Laura on my other side, the way you can feel sun through your eyelids. I told her quietly that the house was safe and the family had bent but not broken, and that I had tried to be the kind of man she believed I could be. I do not measure justice by what fell apart for other people. Not anymore. Justice arrived here as the return of ordinary decency, the dignity of a signature made in clarity, the warmth of a community that asks nothing loud and gives what it can. The knowledge that when a line finally holds, it is not because someone else bent to it, but because you braced it with your own back and decided you would not move. I kept the house. I kept my name. I learned that love is not the currency of guilt, but the quiet continuity of showing up. If one day your own children turn away from you, would you choose to stay silent and endure, or would you stand and protect yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story spoke to you, share and subscribe so others can find it.